And just like that, our last roundtable session of the agenda has gone fast. Thank you all. So, how and why to be bold in a downturn? I just want to contextualize this discussion before we jump into the conversation, because it is important. So a few months ago, actually, so towards the start of the year, David, myself, and a few other marketers descended upon a central London restaurant to discuss kind of the future of marketing and grand discussions around what we should be thinking about from a CMO perspective. And one of the really interesting answers that came from that was that if we're about to enter into a downturn, one of the key aspects of a marketing leader is their boldness, which I thought was fascinating. I hadn't really heard that before, and I really wanted to drill down into that in a different conversation, and this is that conversation. So I'm delighted to welcome these three leaders into the discussion, marketers, and of course, marketing adjacent CEO, so we can get a full look at what it means to be bold and if we need to be bold. So, Simonetta, I'll come to you first, if I may. How and why to be bold in a downturn? Let's do some nomenclature. What does boldness mean to you?
To me, being bold means that you're not just driving, looking at the rear view mirror and worrying about what we've always done, which in many industries like mine, I'm in wealth management, so a relatively conservative industry, but it really means reading the signals and looking at the data that suggests where the open spaces are and being the first to go in a certain direction. And somebody said to me once, if you're one step ahead of the market, you're a genius. If you're 2 steps ahead, you're a fool. And so the boldness is that ability to understand where the 1 step ahead is and avoid the 2 steps.
That liminal space between doing something on the day and doing something not quite tomorrow. Excellent, I love that, I'm going to steal that. David, boldness.
So I'm going to define boldness in the context of some other terms, which I think maybe are useful. So if you think of a circle and you put bold at the top, and then conservative 120 degrees to the left, and then reckless 120 degrees to the right, I think sometimes as a leader you need to be bold, sometimes conservative, and sometimes, not that often, but occasionally you need to be a little bit reckless and take a bet. So to me this is about that picture, and the word that defines it more to me is smart rather than bold or reckless or conservative. So that's how I define it.
Interesting.
Well, I'm a television producer, but we work with a lot of marketers. For me, I think boldness is bravery. It's about being willing to face up to the worst, which of course we had in COVID, when my industry, production, was completely shut down, perhaps forever, certainly for a year we were told initially. So be brave to kind of face the worst, that you may now be about to shut your front door, which of course you don't want to do if you're running a business. And then be willing to look at all the worst possible scenarios, have people around you, bring your generals around you to speak to you in a very candid way and tell you things you probably don't want to hear. And then be willing with your team to come up with a very brave, bold plan to move forwards, because actually there are incredible opportunities in crises. And we're seeing now that there are extraordinary things coming out of COVID. So we have to be willing to face the worst, but then also be open to transformation.
Okay, so we've defined bold. On to the next point. Are we in a downturn, Simonetta?
Well, I think technically speaking, I believe not, right? Data suggests that the UK will be able to avoid a recession, which was initially touted to be happening in the second half of the year. But at the same time, with high interest rates, fiscal pressure, market volatility, and still a war in Europe, I think that the consumers are behaving as in a downturn. And you can see the consumer confidence index had dipped quite a bit since April last year. It's sort of climbing back up, but definitely not in the positive yet. So I think whilst we're not technically in a downturn, it feels that way.
And Evelyn Partners has gone through a large rebrand, so you're all over the Tube network. How has that been as an experience then in a non-technical downturn that still feels like a downturn?
Well, that was I don't know if you know a little bit about my firm. We were created from the merger of two wealth managers, Tilney and Smith and Williamson. I think, speaking of bravery and boldness, our CEO looked at all the data that we presented that suggested we needed a new name because the old one wasn't fit for purpose. And we actually relaunched as Evelyn Partners in the middle of last year, which of course that meant 3 months into a war in Ukraine and the market's not performing as strongly as we would have liked. And in previous companies I was at, we would just have pulled back on marketing at that point, whereas we were very, very consistent. We said we've just rebranded, we are going to be launching our Above the Line campaign, and we spent that money. And immediately we regained the awareness that the individual brands had lost. However, come 2023, new budget, we did pull back on our brand spend, and that could have been seen as a bit of an inconsistent and mixed message. But what we've done, actually, we've stepped up our marketing budget overall. So whilst the brand advertising was put on hold, our overall marketing spend was upped, and we're doing brand building in different ways. So it's really, really interesting to see how boldness doesn't just mean continue to do those things even if the environment around you has changed, but it means that you're going to reconsider, and we're still investing more than we ever have, but we're doing it a bit differently than what we would have done if the markets had performed more solid.
Perhaps in a smart way, to David's point. But and at YPro then, to follow on from that point, David, what have you been up to the last few months that you would consider to be bold? Or, thinking back to your smartness, have you been more conservative, given that point spectrum that you just mentioned?
So I think, and kind of maybe extending the question slightly, I think the way to think about this is to think about kind of your target markets and really how you're breaking out your target markets and how you're doing your segmentation. I mean, I'm fairly certain most of you have been out in central London recently. Not easy to get a table, not easy to get space in a bar. Like central London, if that's a downturn, yeah, I'm really glad we're in a downturn if that's the case. Imagine if it was booming, there would be literally months wait to get a table anywhere. Having said that, when you listen to the narrative that's coming out of business, and particularly large business, and the various analysts that are out there, etc., there is almost a narrative that's emerging around talking ourselves into a downturn. So I think there's these two forces here that are pulling. Consumers seem to be spending strongly still. I'm not seeing evidence of, the person on the street kind of retrenching. When we look then at large business, then clearly there is an element there of pullbacks. We hear of travel freezes and, organizations pausing hiring and those kind of things. And I think, coming back to your original question of, what to do to be bold, I think the question here is to really understand what the advantage is by taking action right now versus waiting. So obviously, if there is an opportunity to get something at a better value, it could be an acquisition that you're doing, it could be talent, it could be taking additional market share, then they are the kind of things to think about and to think about timing. But, as with the stock market, this can often be catching a falling knife. So it's like, when do you pull the trigger on this thing, and how do you make that call? So that's really the magic that we all need to find.
And just sticking with the marketing context before, James, I come to you in a second, what does that feel like for the ethos of the marketing team when you've got all of those different things to balance, when you've got boldness to consider, you've also got conservatism to consider, and you have conflicting messages?
So I'll throw one in. To me, it depends on where your organization's at. If you're a startup with a limited amount of money and a limited runway, and you're looking at the ability to raise more funds, then you have to be really thoughtful about how you spend, what you spend money on, how much you're going to put into search, for example, versus actually maybe switching to, smarter mechanisms like kind of proper content marketing. You know, are you going to go to all those big events that cost you $100 grand a time, or are you going to dial back and do something different in terms of your acquisition strategy? If you're a large, well-funded organization, you may take a different play there. And you know, all of this really looks at, you know, your available resources, your available people, you know, what you think that pathway is. And I think the key thing to me here is, what's your funding position? So how long is that going to run? What's your runway? What do you need to do in terms of preserving margin? And then what you need to do in terms of preserving growth. Because often people can say, look, we need to save money, we need to kind of, you know, everyone stop traveling, let's save money. And then your growth comes down, so your margin also drops in that situation. So you've got these different forces pulling in, you know, alternative directions.
From our perspective, whilst it was a little bit disappointing to say, well, we've just rebranded, we have more work to do to build the awareness on the brand, it was relatively short-lived because we saw two opportunities. The first opportunity was, well, we know that a marketing spend that generate leads and that supports the business presence in certain sectors is really, really valued. So there's an opportunity to do more, and the company had appetite to continue to invest. And so that was exciting for the team. The other one was there's an opportunity to build the brand differently, engaging the field and really winning the hearts and minds and engaging customers on improving our Trustpilot scores, for example. So we basically said, great, we're not going to do it that way. We're going to focus on all these other things that we couldn't do before, and now we're really going to do a call to arms across the entire organization. And that's worked really well for us so far. So there was a little bit of a disappointment, but if you can again see being bold and brave means that seeing the opportunity in the things that you're not doing, that you could be doing, and they don't actually cost you money. And there's always quite a number of them.
Yeah, and also I suppose being bold is continuing despite minor hiccups. It's having the confidence to continue on the journey, knowing it's the medium to long term that's important. James, obviously your perspective is a little different. It's not pure marketing at all, but the quality of boldness is something you are well versed in. What could you share on that quality of boldness from like a leadership perspective?
Well, I think it's interesting, particularly in this forum, is that things are tough out there. The advertising revenue, of course, directly impacts shows that we produce. We produce The Masked Singer, for example, on ITV, and lots of other things too. But what you find in difficult times is that people are more passionate about their brands. So actually a show like The Masked Singer, which of course was incredibly, we were very lucky to get that commission at the beginning of a time when everyone was suddenly wearing masks. It was a happy coincidence. But then people are all sitting at home feeling miserable and lonely and frightened. And it's a show where the whole family sits down, and we reached out to McDonald's, for example, and McDonald's were like, yeah, this is great, this is absolutely on brand for us. So they decided to come on board. Then we reached out to Butlins, and they came on board. And we really found that actually in difficult times, I think there is a sense that you can really promote your brand because you've actually got amazing engagement. You've got millions of people in the country in front of their screens every day. So actually we found that brand engagement really increased in COVID, and in fact since then. Interesting.
And then further on, how do you see that developing?
Well, we have invested in a branded content agency. We bought into them in the middle of COVID because the way content is now funded is so fundamentally different. It's really interesting actually for us working with brands. We work with Credit Suisse, the bank, on a Roger Federer film, and Credit Suisse appears nowhere in the film, which is perhaps fortunate now since the news that's come out about them. I'm sure they'll be fine in the long run. But actually, they wanted to really encapsulate the brand values of Roger Federer, this exceptional athlete who's really into the arts. So that's what spoke to Credit Suisse. And at no place in the film does Credit Suisse name appear, which for us is really different. And then Adidas, for example, they funded a film about the most extraordinary women climbers on the planet. And two of them won gold and silver at the Olympics. And again, at no point did Adidas appear in the film. It only appeared at the end. But what these women encapsulated was very aspirational people at the top of their game winning gold and silver at the Olympics. So we're finding that kind of brand integration is really increasing actually, and I do feel, I'm excited about this. I come from documentary and factual programming, but I do also make fiction and other things too. And 10 or 15 years ago, it was really difficult to get crossover between brands and content. And there was a snobbery on both sides. But actually that has really broken down. I think COVID has very much contributed to that. So I'm excited about this new world we're moving into.
Yeah, so boldness doesn't just have to be about what you're doing when you're doing, but also with whom you're doing it.
Sure.
Fascinating. And back then to your beautiful table of boldness, recklessness, which I'm going to reference forevermore. What then does recklessness look like? Because obviously we're not just telling people to go back to their organisations tomorrow and go, right, scrap the drawing board, I've been told to be bold, let's go for it. What does that look like? Your comment, similar to your quote, it's one day, not 2 days. In practice though, what does that look like?
Well, in practice means that you take a very thoughtful and rigorous approach to your decision making, right? And you look at all of the dimensions of the problem and the opportunity, all the pros and the cons, and you bring as much data as possible to the decision. It also means engaging your stakeholders internally and hearing out their thoughts, understanding what their appetite, because at the end of the day, it is a management judgment call, and the CFO and the CEO will have a good sense for just how much financial prudence they need to put in place. Is it pull the brakes, or we're just going to hold back a bit, but we're going to be in a good place. So a lot of it depends on the financial standing of the company, and recklessness would mean completely flying in the face of that. As a CMO, you don't have that power to spend money you don't have, because obviously, or hopefully, a company has good governance, financial discipline. So the recklessness then turns a bit into a personal career limiting move if you're just going around and making the case for funds without good evidence and without being thoughtful about the financial picture of the company, and then that would be recklessness.
Does boldness or recklessness also then involve if the money, or as the money is tied up by the good governance, in how you organise the team then, how you distribute talent and time on that? Is that what that looks like?
It's talent and resources in this. And going back to my circle analogy, you move past being conservative and careful, and if you're too conservative and hit the brakes too hard, you move into being reckless very quickly. You break your business.
It's like a horseshoe, isn't it?
It kind of goes round in a circle. And the question is, like, where are you on that circle at any particular point? This is really about, as well, working with your team to help them understand, their OKRs or whatever other kind of mechanism you use to define goals. Working with them in an iterative, agile way and changing things. As things move, you're moving away from the kind of metrics and the kind of the areas that you've been measuring and looking at. And team members might have to pivot really, really quickly to do new things based on kind of an uncertain market that's out there. Your digital team may need to completely pivot into, a very different way of doing acquisition. You may need to drop budgets. You may decide that you want to increase your budgets on spend. You may need to move from brand into demand. You've got all of these different, very fluid things that are happening, and I think it's really about creating a culture in your team of transparency, honesty, not hiding stuff from them, like working with them around, this is how we go through this, and just being a genuine marketing leader in that situation and helping them understand where you're going as a team. And maybe people need to change roles. Maybe they need to move into different areas. But actually, if you all pull together, you're all going to get through.
And then moving on then to the next part of the conversation is around your peers, the CEO, the CFO, those individuals that perhaps hold the purse strings and others. What is the relationship with them as the marketing leader flexes their muscles, tries to be bold with what they need to do, how they need to do it, knowing what they know, being data literate, as you said, Simonetta? What's that relationship? I know many of the marketing leaders here have had difficult decisions to make and have had difficult discussions with their CEOs. What would your advice be?
Where to start? different personalities in different roles, clearly. And, you know, you've not just got your CFO and your CEO, you've got your COO as well. If you've got one there, you've got your people leader, you've got your sales leader maybe in your organization. So I think it's about understanding the personality types that you have there and whether they're looking forward or whether they're looking backwards. Your CFO will tend to look backwards, from my experience, and will tend to be looking at, okay, you know, we need to reduce spend with an expectation that automatically the top line number still gets delivered and growth in that top line number still gets delivered. You know, and the link between the actual spending and then how the pipeline flows through isn't necessarily always connected with those people. So I think there's a kind of, you know, an honest and a grown-up conversation to be had with all of those leaders, and the CEO is going to make the call on this, hopefully in a collegiate way with the rest of the C-suite. But it's tough, and you need to make a call as to how the whole C-suite can be smart or bold, rather than just one of you. Marketing on its own cannot be smart. It needs to be all of you pulling together and acting as a team.
I think it's really important that marketing is seen as the part of the solution and not part of the problems, and that requires quite a lot of maturity. And just like we were having the conversation about being Neds, you're an executive, and as an executive you run the business as a whole and you solve for the whole rather than solving for your piece. The other thing that's really important is the quality of the ongoing dialogue with your CEO and their CFO makes all the difference. So in the good times, right, don't just go off and do your thing and deliver great results, but keep engaging. So we meet with our CEO every 2 weeks, and with the equivalent of our Chief Commercial Officer every 2 weeks. And we go through, this is what we've done, this is how the pipeline is coming through, and that engagement makes it much easier. So that when there is tactical opportunity, and we said we wouldn't do this, but there's an opportunity, and then additional funds can get released because you're tapping in, you know, you're making them on the inside, you're bringing them on the inside. And it's really important to be able to bridge the information asymmetry. If everybody has the same information and sees the same things, then it does become a very much an executive judgment-driven call that you can make together as a group.
I think that whole integration piece is critical at the top. In COVID, I set up a Cobra team, and I brought people from HR, from PR, from marketing, comms, operations, finance, around the table. And these are not yes people. These were tough business people who told me stuff I didn't want to hear. You know, it was harsh. But they all had a different perspective, and they all had a vested interest in the business. They all wanted the business to be successful. So by leaning on your great people, you suddenly access this incredible hive mind, and I can't say how powerful that is. I will just say one other thing about recklessness, just to add into the mix. For me, I think one of the worst things you can do is panic. We were facing a possible recession at the end of last year, and my organisation, we looked at, what's going to happen in 23 if we hit recession. But what we didn't do is panic, because as soon as you panic, everybody just loses the plot, and the whole thing just collapses. And it's very quick how you can spiral out of control. So I do think that calm, purposeful leadership piece is absolutely essential. And that comes through being calm in yourself. And, I had my moments of panic, like we all did, but I didn't show them to my team. I saved that for being when I was at home. But I was authentic. I was able to say, look, I'm really worried about what's going on. We do not have all the answers, but we will find a way through. By working through this together, by doing it step by step. And at the beginning of COVID, it was minute by minute, hour by hour, then day by day, and then eventually week by week. But that calm, purposeful leadership piece is so important, because then everybody feels, okay, we don't have all the answers, but as a team, we are going to get there together.
And it's not our first crisis. We've been somewhere here before. And the other element of, I suppose, this conversation in this context is it's about being bold or reckless for yourself, your own career. One of the other, dare I say, humorous moments of that discussion we had a few months ago was, if your CEO doesn't believe in marketing, the best thing you can do for yourself is to leave the company, which I found fascinating. Some might say that would be a reckless move to leave on such a or maybe smart, but my question then is, how on earth does a marketer need to make that really important decision for their own career, for themselves, that could either be bold or reckless? I'm not sure if you've any had experience with that, but...
Absolutely. I'll go first. I think just how quickly you leave is the recklessness piece, right? But the reality is, if your CEO doesn't understand the importance of marketing, is not willing to engage in the conversation or just pays lip service to it, at some point you're going to come at the end of your runway, because your ability to affect change is going to be limited and you'll get frustrated. So I think you need to kind of chart out your journey, and you need to kind of assess at what point personally feeling you're doing more career damage to yourself by staying in the role than by leaving in the role. And if you do choose to leave, how you leave is just as important for your own personal brand. But I think that at some point you have to look at yourself really honestly and say, is this a place where I can really deliver impact? I would say as a marketer, I don't view my definition of success as the size of my budget, right? But really how much I'm contributing to the growth of the business and to the change agenda of the business. So sometimes it means you have to pare back budget and you have to solve a common problem. But as long as you're still central to the mission of the business you're in, that can be okay as well. And it's when you feel a bit marginalized and unable to affect change, and then you have to sort of reflect and make some tough calls.
What kind of community do you build around yourself to make sure you are doing the right thing, and it's a conversation that is objectively difficult, and it's not something that you are misinterpreting perhaps?
So I think there's a couple of communities. There's communities of your peers, such as the wonderful people here. And the many friends you've got across at a similar level, at a leadership level. There's the community inside the organization, maybe people outside of marketing, other people that connect as coaches and mentors. And then obviously there's your team as well, and I think, the self-awareness that you bring to your role and leaving your role, etc. You also have to bring a sense of the group that you're a leader of there, and if you walk away from that group at that point, is that the right thing to do? You typically, or from my experience, you typically see more people departing after a crisis rather than during a crisis, because they stay to kind of keep the ship going, to keep everything in place. Damage is done to those people during that time, and then they move on afterwards, when things are a little stable and they say, well, look, my people will be okay, I'm going to move on. This isn't for me. So I think there's there's a whole range of things to balance in that conversation. Your personal values, your self-awareness, how hungry you are for your career, exactly what you want to do, and what you're willing to accept from, the other leaders in the business. Particularly if things get toxic or start to kind of melt down in some way.
I'd really add as well into that training. I'm a real advocate for training. I've done a lot of training in my adult career. I went to the business school at Oxford for a stint. I went to the grad school at Stanford in California because I wanted to learn about, we were talking about California earlier, learn about how that incredible kind of fault line of science, technology, finance and creativity, how did they do it? I wanted to learn that. So we do try and promote training in our business, but I'd really advocate, if people are in doubt, there's nothing like going to surround yourself with some really smart thinkers, professors at these amazing universities or elsewhere, and they talk to me about helicopter thinking. Take you out of your world and give you a 30,000 view of your world, but from a completely new perspective. And suddenly you start to think, well, actually that's really not that important to me anymore, or I've got the wrong end of the stick and I need to be doing more of this. And then you can change your life that way. You have opportunities then to rethink.
And you've got that self-confidence then to be bold, which I think is probably one of the main stumbling blocks we don't really think about. But I was going to say, James, is there anything we're missing in this conversation? I know that you have written a book.
We have some copies actually at the exit for you.
On this exact topic. So
yeah, I wrote the book to be purposeful actually. I wrote it to be a useful tool because I'm a chief exec of a production group. We're a big company. We're the largest independent in the UK, and we're 50-50 UK-US. At the beginning of COVID, there was no manual. There was no, there we were locked out. I remember locking the door of my business and thinking, shit, this could be it. And that was really scary. But little by little, by reaching out, there was an amazing amount of connection and information, and the community really came together. And I've seen, Creative UK, for example, which is this extraordinary organisation, has made me realise we employ 2 million people in this country in the creative sector. We bring 116 billion to the British economy, and we work very closely with marketers at every single level. All we do is B2B and B2C. We do all of that stuff. So it's very important for your sector to be part of the creative sector as well, because by working together we can absolutely deliver on global Britain, which we have to deliver on right now, right? So anyway, I wrote the book because it was nerve-wracking, and I wanted there to be a manual that people could then pick up and go, you know what, it's not easy. None of this stuff's easy. We made a lot of tough decisions in leadership roles. Everybody in the room will remember how painful it was. But we came out on top. Look, we're all here. We have survived. We have forged new connections. There are new opportunities that are emerging. So I wrote the book to be, I hope, helpful. So not just for this generation, but also people coming down the track. So when the next pandemic happens, and there will inevitably be other horrendous things that are going to come our way, at least this, and I'm sure there will be others, will be there available so people can pick it up and go, you know what, they did it, maybe I can do it too.
Yeah, simply knowing that we're on the same boat is so helpful sometimes. Again, I'm going to pause here just because I know we are well into the discussion, and I want to break for any questions from the audience whilst you have our rapt attention. Yes, one roaming mic coming right up. Oh yeah, go. Please project. Be bold.
Thank you. Do you think that sometimes the language that we use, words like bold and brave, is really unhelpful? It's never been easier to measure what's effective marketing. And yet we call it, bold and brave. I can't think of another sector. Can you imagine in medicine if they came up with and understood the most effective ways to get positive outcomes? They'd call it bold and brave, or would they just call it sensible, astute, clever? I'm going to do some, clever marketing. And I just wonder sometimes, because language falls under the remit of marketing, whether we should just ban words like that, because it raises notions of fear, which Lee talked about in the opening session. Oh, if I've got to be bold and brave, that involves fear. You've given me a reason not to do it because you've defined effective marketing as bold and brave, when actually it should be sensible and involve no fear, because every year that goes by there's another data set that implies and it kind of instructs us in what is the right way to do marketing. We've never been more informed. There should be less fear. And I just wonder sometimes as marketers if we're, for the purpose of a headline, our own worst enemies.
It's a great provocation. Thank you. I think the response I would give to that is, I don't agree with your point that it's the most easy now to measure marketing impact as it's ever been. I think certainly every organization I've ever worked with has struggled to measure and manage the funnel, to really deal with proper multi-touch attribution, buying groups, how the different channels that you've got are collaborating together. So the data points we've got have exploded. So I'll agree with you on that. Us being able to bring them together into context and to gain real genuine insight and understanding, particularly as we move into, different types of data permissions, different use of third-party data, etc. It's becoming, to me, certainly on the B2B side, harder and harder to do that kind of work and to measure those things. And then all of that then comes together with the challenge of, coming back to the point of working with your sales leaders, your CFOs, etc. The fact that we've got different terms for different parts of the pipeline. We're looking here at traffic on the website, traffic through channels, number of people at events, how they go down into contacts and leads and MQLs, and then sales takes them all over, and are we like connecting back up through the funnel? So all of this is really, really hard. Sales are measuring revenue, outcomes, output. We often are measuring leads and lead flow and lead conversion rates, and we talk often in terms that the other pieces of the business don't think are that important at all. The conversion of your MQL through to an SQL or an SAL, depending on which way you're structuring it, that rate can change dramatically. Marketing thinks it's winning and being successful. Sales thinks it's not working out there. So I think it's a really difficult, the amount of data we've got, the number of data points is really hard, and the fact we've got no kind of common semantic structure that everyone buys into is, I think it's a really important thing just to internalize and try and figure out how to take forward with your peers, how to make sure marketing is in the weekly pipeline reviews, for example. You need to be there as a marketing leader when they're doing the pipeline review and saying, look, here's the channels, here's the leads, here's the conversion rates coming down into the pipe. Now here's the individual segments or geographies or products, however you're measuring it. You've got to be at the table, because marketing and sales it's a single team. It's not two teams.
And that's that fortnightly marketing plus sales plus CEO dialogue is the one reason why we were able to increase marketing spend in the face of significant uncertainty. But I think that there's a good point around avoiding emotional language. We can use that here to provoke ourselves and to inspire ourselves, but it really is, especially in times where there is uncertainty, being really analytical, thoughtful and objective, looking at all of the options and looking at all of the dimensions of a decision is what's going to help us as marketers be seen as executive leaders of the whole, and therefore be, whether the number goes up or down, be a voice at the table and a voice that can influence. And if instead we fall prey to our own emotions or look at things, in an incomplete and partial way, then we will not be heard, and there will be that damage.
We are creative, though.
We are. We have to.
Maybe it's just creative life.
Synonyms of bold. Any other questions? Thank you for your question. Okay, we'll go on to the next part then. Good job, I've got questions. Just before we close off the discussion then and head off to our keynote speaker, what then have you learned from your past experience? I'll come to you first, James, actually, given you've obviously got a book about it and you've got some past experience to share. What would be the key priorities then for you moving forward if you were to, or as you are explaining what it means to be bold, brave, smart, synonyms ad infinitum, moving forward?
I think one of the most important things is not to make any knee-jerk reactions, and that means critically keeping your people. Hold on to your people. We saw many industries, and people in my industry too, who just dumped people in the last credit crunch, in the recessions that we've been through, in COVID. And that is the worst thing you can do. Your people are your lifeblood. One, you're letting go of great people who you need, and you may need to renegotiate contracts. You may need to say, I can't afford to pay you 5 days a week. Would you go down to 1 day a week? Or whatever it might be, whatever your particular financial arrangements may be. But also, it gives completely, you're in the world of marketing, it gives completely the wrong marketing message to your people, your clients, your world. It says you don't care about the people who work under your roof. It is just terrible, terrible marketing and terrible business, and just absolute, for me, the absolute no-no, if it had to be one thing, do not let go of your people. You must retain your talent.
You should have been on the previous panel, James.
I listened to it carefully.
Simonetta.
So, as you grow and develop as a leader, as an executive, you go through a journey, right? And I think where I net out is, somebody quoted this from a movie, so it's not my own original, but sometimes when you win, you lose, and sometimes when you lose, you win. And I always kind of think about, if a decision is not going my way, am I losing really? Because this could be a win, right? And equally, if I if a decision is going my way, I kind of think about, what are the side consequences of that? And I think that ability to detach yourself emotionally from the specific decision, right, about a budget or about headcount, etc., can be quite helpful in keeping your sanity and then being quite objective about deciding when is my time done here versus actually, no, I just have to solve a problem with everyone else, but there is light at the end of that tunnel.
Perspective.
Perspective.
David.
What have I learned? I'm a big fan of authors in general. I'm very respectful to anyone who can manage to write that much and finish it without getting distracted. I particularly like, obviously, your book, but also Ryan Holiday. I don't know whether you've come across Ryan Holiday. Interesting blogger and writer, has some great books, and he leverages a lot of stoical thinking, and has a really interesting book called The Obstacle is the Way. And the message behind this is that actually when you see, an impenetrable obstacle, that forces you to change your thinking, change who you are, and change the path that you're taking, and that actually is the thing that will get you to where you're going. So if we can start to see these things as gifts rather than negative things, we can then start to say, okay, how do we tackle this pandemic, bankruptcy, personal life difficulty, and how does it make us a better person? Because it grows us, it builds us, and we come out the other end as a different human being, different organization, etc. So I'd say think about like how you use that obstacle to improve your situation and take you to that next place.
Well, I didn't think we'd get philosophical, but no, I love it. That's before the wine as well. Thank you all very much for your time this afternoon. And again, like I said, the context of the discussion was so interesting. I thought it worthy of a debate, and I'm glad we did it. So thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.